On a crisp autumn morning, the hallways of Riverside Middle School buzzed with the usual energy of students rushing to their first classes. Among them was a 7th grader who always chose the seat in the back corner of room 203. He was the kind of student who carried extra books, not because they were assigned, but because he couldn't get enough of learning. That morning, his backpack was a little heavier than usual. Inside was a carefully crafted physics project he'd spent weeks perfecting. The assignment had been simple: explain a scientific concept to your classmates. But this student had gone far beyond the basics. His project wasn't just about explaining gravity or force. He'd developed an entire presentation about quantum physics and its real-world applications. The classroom was filling up as he pulled out his work. Around him, other students were presenting posters about the water cycle and simple machines. Some had made papier-mâché volcanoes, while others had basic diagrams about photosynthesis. All good projects, but nothing like what he had created. Mrs. Walsh, the science teacher, moved through the rows of desks, nodding and giving quick feedback to each student. She had been teaching at Riverside for 15 years and had a reputation for being strict but fair. At least, that's what everyone said. When she reached his desk, the young student's heart raced with excitement. He'd stayed up late many nights, double-checking his calculations and perfecting his diagrams. The project included hand-drawn illustrations of quantum entanglement, mathematical equations that most high school students wouldn't understand, and real-world examples that he'd researched from scientific journals. "Here's my project, Mrs. Walsh," he said quietly, holding out his work with slightly trembling hands. This was his chance to show what he could really do. Mrs. Walsh took one brief look at the pages. Her eyebrows furrowed as she flipped through them quickly, too quickly to actually read anything. The student could see she wasn't really looking at the detailed explanations he'd written or the complex diagrams he'd drawn. "Where did you copy this from?" she asked, her voice sharp and dismissive. The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. I didn't copy it," he responded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did all the research myself. I can explain how." "This is clearly beyond 7th grade level," Mrs. Walsh cut him off. "I asked for a simple science project, not something copied from a college textbook. I can't accept this." The other students had gone quiet, watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, but no one said anything. "But I can prove it's my work," the student persisted, reaching for his notebook filled with drafts and research notes. "I have all my sources and—" "That's enough," Mrs. Walsh said firmly, placing his project back on his desk. "Submit something appropriate for your grade level by tomorrow, or you'll receive a 0. The student sat there, stunned, as Mrs. Walsh moved on to the next desk, as if nothing had happened. His hands rested on the project he poured his heart into, his fingers tracing the edges of pages filled with work that no one would even look at. What hurt most wasn't the rejection, it was the assumption that he couldn't possibly have done this work. That someone like him wasn't capable of understanding advanced physics. That his dedication and passion for science somehow didn't fit someone else's expectations. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but he barely heard it. As other students packed up their volcanoes and posters, chattering about lunch plans, he carefully placed his rejected project back in his backpack. But instead of feeling defeated, something inside him strengthened. He knew his work was good. He knew what he was capable of. And somehow, someday, he would prove it. What he didn't know was that this moment, this unfair dismissal of his hard work, would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life, but would transform the entire school's approach to recognizing and nurturing student talent. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of injustice, and the greatest victories come after the hardest setbacks. What his science teacher didn't know, what no one at school really knew, was the story behind that rejected physics project. It was a story that began in a small apartment on the east side of town, where a single mom worked night shifts at the local hospital to keep the lights on and food on the table. Every evening, after finishing his homework, the young student would transform their tiny living room into his personal laboratory. The coffee table became his workbench, scattered with library books and notepads filled with calculations. The old laptop his mom had bought from a thrift store was his window to the world of advanced physics. His mom would often find him asleep on the couch, surrounded by papers covered in complex equations, the laptop still playing MIT OpenCourseWare lectures. She'd gently wake him, her hospital scrubs still on after her 12-hour shift. "Time for bed, sweetheart," she'd say, looking at his notes with a mixture of pride and amazement. She didn't understand the equations or theories he was studying, but she understood passion when she saw it. On her breaks at the hospital, she'd search for free educational resources on her phone, sending him links to science websites and virtual physics simulations. Sometimes she'd pick up discarded science magazines from the hospital waiting room, bringing them home like precious gifts. "I might not be able to buy you a fancy tutor," she'd tell him, "but that brilliant mind of yours is going to take you places." Her unwavering belief in him meant everything. The local library became his second home. The librarians knew him by sight. The boy who would spend hours in the science section, carefully copying passages from textbooks he couldn't afford to buy. One kind librarian even started setting aside science magazines and journals that other people were going to throw away. At home, he conducted experiments with whatever he could find. The kitchen became his physics lab. He studied momentum by rolling different-sized cans down boards propped against the couch. He learned about gravity by timing the fall of various objects from different heights, using his mom's old phone as a stopwatch. The bathroom mirror helped him understand light reflection, and the microwave became his tool for studying wave patterns. His room was a testament to his dedication. The walls were covered not with posters of athletes or musicians, but with hand-drawn diagrams of atomic structures and quantum theories. He'd made his own periodic table, adding notes and connections as he learned more. Above his bed hung a map of the stars, marked with constellations he'd learned to identify from his apartment window. Late at night, when the city grew quiet, he'd sit by his window with a notebook, watching the stars and dreaming about the mysteries of the universe. He'd write down questions that his regular science classes never answered. How does quantum entanglement work? What happens inside a black hole? Could string theory explain everything? His mom would sometimes join him during these late-night stargazing sessions, bringing 2 cups of hot chocolate. She'd listen as he excitedly explained his latest discoveries, even though much of it went over her head. "You remind me of your father," she'd say softly. He was always curious about how things worked. It was one of the few times she spoke about his dad, who had passed away when he was too young to remember. The rejection of his physics project hit hard, not just because of the unfairness, but because of all the hours of work behind it. Each page represented countless nights of study. Every diagram was born from experiments conducted in their small apartment, every calculation checked and rechecked by flashlight after bedtime. But his mother had taught him something important. Real passion doesn't need validation from others to keep burning. That evening, after the disappointing day at school, he didn't give up. Instead, he sat down at their wobbly kitchen table and began working on something new. His mom watched from the doorway, still in her nurse's uniform, as he opened his notebooks and started writing. "What are you working on now?" she asked. He looked up with determination in his eyes. "I'm going to prove them wrong," he said quietly. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been told they can't do something." His mom smiled, understanding that this moment was about more than just a school project. It was about standing up for yourself, about believing in your abilities even when others don't. She walked over and kissed the top of his head. "Then you better get to work," she said, "because the world needs to hear what you have to say." Sometimes life has a funny way of putting the right person in the right place at just the right time. For the young student, that person arrived in the form of a substitute teacher who showed up at Riverside Middle School on a rainy Tuesday morning. Mr. Chen wasn't your typical substitute. With his slightly rumpled blazer and old-fashioned briefcase covered in physics-related stickers, he stood out from the moment he walked through the school doors. A former research scientist with a PhD in quantum physics, he had recently switched to teaching because, as he often said, the future of science sits in our classrooms, not our laboratories. The cafeteria was buzzing with its usual lunchtime chaos when Mr. Chen first noticed something unusual. In the far corner, away from the noisy crowds, sat a student completely absorbed in what appeared to be a scientific journal. Curious, Mr. Chen walked closer, expecting to find a comic book hidden inside the pages. Instead, he saw complex quantum mechanics equations scribbled in the margins of the journal. "That's an interesting way to spend lunch," Mr. Chen said, pulling up a chair. The student quickly tried to hide his notes, but Mr. Chen had already spotted a familiar equation. "Wait, is that Schrödinger's equation?" The student hesitated, then nodded slowly. He'd learned to be cautious about showing his interest in advanced physics, but there was something different about Mr. Chen's genuine curiosity. "Would you mind explaining your notes to me?" Mr. Chen asked, pointing to the scribbled calculations. "I'm particularly interested in how you're applying this to real-world scenarios." For the next 20 minutes, the student excitedly explained his theories, his words tumbling out faster and faster as he realized Mr. Chen not only understood, but was asking thoughtful questions. It was the first time someone at school had actually wanted to hear about his ideas. "This is remarkable work," Mr. Chen said, adjusting his glasses. "Have you shown this to your science teacher?" The student's enthusiasm dimmed. He told Mr. Chen about the rejected physics project, about being accused of copying, about the 0 he received when he refused to submit a simpler project. Mr. Chen's expression grew serious. "Would you mind if I looked at that project?" The next day, during his free period, Mr. Chen found himself in the school library, carefully reviewing the student's work. Each page revealed a depth of understanding that went far beyond middle school level. But what impressed him most wasn't just the advanced concepts, it was the original thinking, the creative connections, the unique approaches to complex problems. He noticed something else too. In the margins of the project were little notes of encouragement written in different handwriting. "Keep going, honey. This is amazing. I don't understand it, but I'm proud of you." The student's mother had clearly been his cheerleader through this whole journey. Mr. Chen remembered his own childhood, how one teacher's belief in him had changed the course of his life. He thought about all the brilliant minds that might have been lost because no one took the time to look closer to see past their preconceptions. That afternoon, instead of heading home after his substitute duties were done, Mr. Chen made his way to the principal's office. He carried with him not just the student's project, but also his own detailed analysis of the work, comparing it to undergraduate-level physics research. "I need to speak with you about a student," he said to the secretary. "It's about discovering one of the brightest young minds I've encountered in 20 years of scientific research." The secretary looked up, startled by the urgency in his voice. "The principal is in a meeting." "Then I'll wait," Mr. Chen said, settling into a chair. He opened his briefcase and pulled out more papers, printouts of similar cases where gifted students had been overlooked, statistics about bias in identifying gifted children, and a detailed plan he'd stayed up late writing. He thought about the student probably sitting in class right now, still hiding his brilliant mind because no one had given him permission to shine. "I'll wait as long as it takes," he added quietly, "because this can't wait another day." Some battles are fought with weapons, others with words. But the most important battles are often fought with patience, persistence, and the unwavering belief that every student deserves the chance to reach their full potential. Mr. Chen was ready for this battle, armed with evidence, passion, and the determination to ensure that at least this one brilliant light wouldn't be dimmed by oversight or prejudice. The principal's office was silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning as Mr. Chen spread out the students' work across the large conference table. Present were the principal, the head of the science department, and Mrs. Walsh, whose face had grown increasingly pale as she looked at the evidence before her. "Let me show you something remarkable," Mr. Chen began, pulling out the original physics project that had been dismissed. "What appears at first glance to be a simple middle school assignment is actually something extraordinary." He pointed to the first page of calculations. "These aren't copied from a textbook. In fact, they can't be, because this is an original approach to explaining quantum entanglement. Look at how he's created an analogy using everyday objects to make quantum physics understandable to his classmates." The science department head leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. This is undergraduate-level work," she whispered. "Exactly," Mr. Chen continued, his voice growing animated. "But what's truly brilliant is how he's broken down complex concepts into simple terms. He's not just understanding the physics, he's finding new ways to explain it." He pulled out more papers from his briefcase, the student's notebook from the past 6 months. Each page was filled with careful observations, detailed experiments conducted with household items, and questions that showed remarkable insight. "Look at this experiment," Mr. Chen said, pointing to a series of drawings. He used his mother's kitchen timer and different-sized cans to study gravitational acceleration. When he couldn't afford proper lab equipment, he improvised. He turned his entire home into a physics laboratory. The principal picked up one of the papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These notes in the margins." "Those are his mother's comments," Mr. Chen explained softly. "She works night shifts at the hospital. She might not understand the physics, but she's been encouraging him every step of the way. Look at the dates. Some of these are written at 3 a.m. She was reviewing his work after her night shifts." Mrs. Walsh shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "But how can we be sure this is really his work? It seems impossible." Mr. Chen pulled out his laptop. "I had the same question, so I tested him. Yesterday at lunch, I asked him to explain these concepts to me. I recorded our conversation with his permission." He pressed play. The room filled with the student's voice, explaining complex quantum theories with the kind of deep understanding that couldn't be faked. His excitement was clear as he connected ideas, drawing parallels between quantum mechanics and everyday life. When he struggled to find the right words, he created his own analogies, comparing quantum entanglement to twins who always know what the other is thinking, no matter how far apart they are. "Listen to how he thinks," Mr. Chen said, stopping the recording. "This isn't memorization. This is true understanding. But more than that, this is innovation. He's not just learning physics, he's finding new ways to make it accessible to others." He pulled out one final document, a comparative analysis he'd done of the students' work against standard physics curricula from middle school through undergraduate level. "This young man isn't just gifted," Mr. Chen explained, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "He has the potential to change how we teach physics. His ability to break down complex concepts into understandable pieces, his creative approaches to experimentation with limited resources, these aren't just signs of intelligence. They're signs of someone who could revolutionize science education." The principal sat back in his chair, looking at the spread of papers before him. "Why didn't we see this before?" "Sometimes," Mr. Chen said gently, "we see what we expect to see. But true education means looking deeper, looking past our preconceptions. This student has been quietly excelling, not for grades or recognition, but out of pure love for science. And despite being dismissed and discouraged, he never stopped learning." He gathered the papers together carefully. "The question now isn't whether he copied this work. The question is, what are we going to do to nurture this extraordinary talent? How will we make sure no other gifted student goes unrecognized? Because this isn't just about one student or one project. It's about creating an environment where every student's potential is seen and valued." The room fell quiet as his words sank in. Through the window, they could see students crossing the courtyard for their next classes. Somewhere among them was a young scientist who had been quietly waiting for someone to understand what he was capable of. The principal picked up his phone. "Get me the contact information for the state's gifted program evaluation team," he said to his secretary, "and clear my schedule for the afternoon. We have some changes to make." As the meeting wrapped up, Mr. Chen gathered his materials, including the original physics project that had started it all. On the cover page, beneath the complex equations and careful diagrams, was a simple note in a mother's handwriting. "You're going to change the world someday, sweetheart." Mr. Chen smiled, knowing that day might come sooner than anyone had expected. The next morning, the school's conference room was packed with people who rarely sat together. The principal, the entire science department, members of the school board, and even representatives from the state's education department. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. At the front of the room stood Mr. Chen, methodically pinning papers to a large board. Each one told part of a story, not just about one brilliant student, but about a system that needed to change. He'd spent the entire night preparing this presentation, fueled by coffee and a determination to make this moment count. "What you're about to see," he began, his voice steady and clear, "isn't just about one rejected physics project. It's about how many other gifted students we might be missing because we're not really looking." He started with the students' work, showing how it progressed over months of independent study. Then he revealed something more troubling. a pattern of similar incidents across different classes and years. Other bright students who had been overlooked, their potential dismissed because they didn't fit someone's idea of what a gifted student should look like. Mrs. Walsh sat in the back row, her face growing more uncomfortable with each example. When Mr. Chen showed the recording of the student explaining complex quantum theories, she couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The issue here, Mr. Chen continued, his voice gentle but firm, isn't about pointing fingers. It's about recognizing that we all have blind spots we need to address. Every educator in this room became a teacher because they wanted to help students succeed. But sometimes our preconceptions get in the way of seeing what's right in front of us. The state education representative leaned forward. How many other students might we be missing? Mr. Chen clicked to his next slide. I did some research into our gifted program demographics. The numbers on the screen told their own story, clear patterns of which students were being identified as gifted and which weren't. But here's the good news, he said, changing the slide again. Other schools have successfully addressed these exact issues. When they implemented blind evaluation systems and comprehensive testing for all students, they discovered incredible talent that had been hiding in plain sight. The principal stood up, his face serious. What specific changes are you proposing? Mr. Chen had been waiting for this question. He pulled out a detailed proposal, mandatory bias training for all educators, new evaluation systems that focused on actual work rather than assumptions, regular screening of all students for advanced learning opportunities, and partnerships with local universities to provide resources and mentorship. The cost of these changes is nothing, he said firmly, compared to the cost of losing brilliant minds because we failed to nurture them. A school board member raised her hand. This all started because of one student's physics project. No, Mr. Chen corrected gently. This started because one student refused to give up on his passion for learning, even when the system failed him. He continued studying advanced physics in secret, conducting experiments with household items, teaching himself college-level concepts, not for grades or recognition, but because he genuinely loves science. He paused, letting his words sink in. The real question is, how many other students have similar passions and talents that they're hiding because they don't think anyone will believe in them? The room fell silent. Through the window, they could hear the sounds of students changing classes, their voices and footsteps echoing in the hallway. Mrs. Walsh suddenly stood up. Her voice shook slightly, but her words were clear. I need to say something. All eyes turned to her. I was wrong. Not just about this student, but about how I've been evaluating all my students. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and that's not what a teacher should do. The principal nodded slowly. I think we all need to acknowledge that we can do better. The question is, are we willing to make the changes necessary to ensure this never happens again? One by one, heads nodded around the room. The state representatives were already making notes, and the school board members were huddled together, discussing immediate actions they could take. As the meeting wrapped up, Mr. Chen gathered his materials. A small note fell from between his papers. It was from the student's mother, written on the back of a hospital cafeteria receipt. Thank you for seeing what I've always known was there. He smiled, tucking the note carefully into his pocket. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments: a rejected project, a curious substitute teacher, a mother's unwavering belief in her child. But what matters most is what happens next, when people are brave enough to confront uncomfortable truths and committed enough to make real changes. Outside the conference room, the normal school day continued. But inside, a transformation had begun that would change not just one student's life, but the lives of countless students to come. After her eye-opening experience with her gifted student, the teacher began to look at her class and her own attitudes in a new light. She had always thought of herself as fair and impartial, treating all her students the same. But now she realized that her subconscious biases had caused her to have different expectations and make unfair assumptions about certain kids, especially minorities and those from low-income families, without even realizing it. She felt guilty remembering all the times she had dismissed the work of some of her students of color without giving it real consideration, while paying more attention to white students. And she cringed to think of the messages those actions had sent, that she didn't expect much from them and that their efforts weren't valuable. What potential had she failed to nurture in her classroom by letting her prejudices cloud her judgment? The teacher resolved to do better going forward. From that day on, she made a real effort to give all her students equal time, consideration, and encouragement, regardless of their race or background. Instead of making snap judgments when a child turned in an assignment, she carefully reviewed all their work. She focused on getting to know each student as an individual with unique strengths, challenges, and gifts. As she worked to confront her own biases and change her behavior, the teacher saw her classroom start to shift. When she paid attention, asked questions, and offered praise, students who had previously hung back and disengaged started to open up and share more. Lively discussions erupted as kids who once rarely spoke up began to contribute. Pupils who used to turn in hastily done, sloppy assignments put in more effort when they knew she would really look at their work. And as she got to know them, the teacher's preconceived notions about certain students crumbled away, and she marveled at the talent, determination, and heart she discovered in every child. Her commitment to nurturing each individual student's abilities paid off tremendously for her exceptionally bright pupil. Once she realized just how mathematically gifted he was, she arranged for him to be tested. As she suspected, his abilities were far above average for his age. So she made sure he had opportunities to keep learning at an advanced level, giving him extra enrichment work when he sped through the standard material and advocating for him to be placed in accelerated classes. He thrived with this additional support and challenge, no longer held back by low expectations. His natural love of math deepened into a real passion. While especially talented, this boy was just one of many students who blossomed that year under a teacher who believed in them. Bit by bit, the kids came to understand that in her classroom, it didn't matter what they looked like, how much money their families had, how they spoke, or where they lived. She valued them all and would push them to be their best selves. With this foundation of support and high expectations, that class made immense academic and personal growth. Even years later, after they had moved on to other grades, those kids still remembered that teacher as the one who saw something in them when no one else had bothered to look closely. She was the one who noticed their strengths, encouraged their interests, and made them feel like their thoughts and abilities mattered. In small ways and big, she altered the trajectory of their lives by simply taking the time to really see them. As for the teacher, that pivotal year fundamentally changed her approach to education. No longer could she just go through the motions, allowing her unconscious judgments to dictate her interactions. She had seen the incredible untapped potential that lived within every child and understood the power she had to either suppress or elevate it. From that point forward, she worked hard to challenge her own assumptions, to build relationships with students as individuals, and to create a classroom environment where everyone felt valued and capable. It wasn't always easy. Confronting her own deeply ingrained biases was uncomfortable, and it took a lot of energy to make sure each of her students got the focus they deserved. But she knew it was worth the effort every time she saw a child's eyes light up with excitement about learning, witnessed the pride of a student accomplishing something they never thought they could, or heard from a parent how much her belief in their child meant to them. Her experience that year had shown her in the most personal way how much untold damage a teacher's prejudices and low expectations could do, and on the flip side, how transformative it was when a teacher truly believed in a child's potential. She carried that lesson with her for the rest of her career, touching countless lives by seeing the best in every student who came through her door. No matter who they were or where they came from, she would strive to give them the same thing she had given to that exceptional boy, the knowledge that they had gifts to be nurtured and a teacher who cared enough to help them realize just what they were capable of. The exceptionally bright student's life was forever changed by the teacher who finally recognized his gifts. Before that fateful year in her class, he had been a kid full of potential but lacking the support to fully develop it. He had always loved math, eagerly devouring new concepts and speeding through worksheets, but his previous teachers had never noticed his unique abilities. They saw a quiet boy who kept to himself and didn't demand attention, so they left him to work independently without really challenging him. His natural talent went unidentified and unnurtured. But that all changed when his fifth-grade teacher took the time to really look at his work and see what he was capable of. When she called his mother to share that her son was extraordinarily gifted in math, the woman was thrilled but not entirely surprised. She had always sensed he had a special mind, even if she didn't have the knowledge to put a name to it. Together, the teacher and mother worked to get him evaluated and connected with resources for gifted students. At first, the boy was a bit anxious about being singled out for his high abilities. All his life he had been content to coast by unnoticed, and now suddenly he was getting all this attention. But his teacher was there to reassure him, explaining that being gifted was simply a special difference, like having an unusual talent for music or art. She made it clear that nurturing his exceptional math skills was a way to help him grow, not to set him apart. With her steady encouragement, he began to come out of his shell and take pride in his unique mind. As his teacher advocated for him to receive accelerated instruction and enrichment, the boy found himself in new environments that challenged and engaged him like never before. In his gifted math classes, he was surrounded by kids who were thrilled to talk about things like fractals and prime numbers. When he joined the school math team, he met older students and coaches who showed him where his talents could take him in the future. For the first time, he felt like he fully belonged somewhere. With each new opportunity and success, the boy's confidence grew. He became more outgoing and eager to share his love of math with others. He took on leadership roles, mentoring younger students who were just discovering a passion for numbers. His teachers and classmates alike marveled at the way he could break down complex concepts and find creative solutions to tricky problems. It was clear he had a rare gift. As he transitioned to middle and then high school, the boy continued to seek out math learning experiences beyond the standard curriculum. He devoured piles of books on obscure areas of mathematics, attended summer programs for gifted math students, and racked up awards in competitions. Pursuing his talent brought him immense joy and a sense of purpose. While still somewhat reserved by nature, he had blossomed into a poised, curious, and thoughtful young man with a bright future ahead of him. None of that would have happened without the dedication of that fifth-grade teacher who looked past outward appearances and first impressions to discover the extraordinary ability hidden within a quiet child. Her recognition of his gifts, at such a pivotal moment in his education, altered his entire life path. She connected him with the resources and opportunities he needed to nurture his brilliance. She instilled in him the confidence to embrace and take pride in his talents. In countless small moments of encouragement and belief, she set him on the road to becoming everything he was meant to be. As he grew older, the boy never forgot the incredible impact that one teacher had on his life. Even as his world expanded and he met many other influential mentors, he always remembered her as the one who saw his potential before anyone else. He kept in touch with her over the years, sharing his milestones and thanking her again and again for changing his future. And when the time came, he knew without a doubt that he wanted to become a teacher himself, to have the same life-altering impact on other children that she'd had on him. Today, that once overlooked little boy is a brilliant mathematician and professor internationally renowned for his groundbreaking work in the field. He spends his days unraveling the elegant mysteries of numbers and his nights poring over the latest proofs. But his favorite moments are the ones he spends in the classroom, teaching the next generation of mathematicians. He looks out at his students and sees himself in the quiet kids who hang back, full of untapped potential waiting for someone to notice. In each of them, he sees that one special teacher who transformed his life with her belief in him. So he carries on the legacy that she began. With gentle patience and infectious enthusiasm, he helps his students discover the marvel and beauty of mathematics. He encourages the ones who doubt themselves, advocates for those who need extra support, and challenges the gifted kids thirsting for knowledge. Every day, he tries to be the teacher who changes lives by recognizing the extraordinary abilities in every child, the teacher who, simply by taking the time to look closer, helps his students' brightest gifts shine through.